session today, we're going to talk about religion and public education. And I want to talk about that in two respects, which I guess would be Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 in your notes for this lecture. First of all, I want to talk about the legality or the constitutionality of studying religion in a public educational setting. And then secondly, I want to talk about the relevance of studying religion in a public educational setting. So those would be your two big Roman numeral 1 and 2 notes for today's lecture. So let's start out talking about the legality or the constitutionality of religion in a public educational setting. In my live classes, when we get to this point, I ask students, you tell me what you know is legal, what's okay, or what's not okay as far as religion in a public educational setting. And they just start telling me things policies from their own schools that they went to, public schools, things they've heard in the media, things that they have heard about in other universities, and I just start listing all those things on the board. Well, as we do that, we end up with things on the board that say things like our coach led prayers before football games with our teams. Our team would gather on the court after every basketball game with the opposing team, and we would pray together on the court. Some would say that our team would pray together, but the coaches couldn't be a part of that. Students had to initiate that. Some would say that they have baccalaureates at their school and that school officials are involved in that baccalaureate, which is kind of like a religiously oriented service for graduates. Others would say, we don't have baccalaureates at our school anymore. We have them at a church in town, and it's entirely run by local clergy and by students. There are no school administrators involved. Some say that they have religious organizations in their public school. Others say that they can't have religious organizations in their public school. We end up with a whole assortment of things, and when we get done with that list of maybe 20, 25 different policies, different practices on the board, I ask students, so when you look at this list, what do you see here? What observation could you make? And generally, one of those observations is there's not much consistency. There's a lot of variation. Things aren't the same. And yet, these are policies, these are practices that are in force in different public school settings, often even just right here in the state of Missouri. So then we talk about, how do you know? How do you know what's okay and what's not okay? And really it comes down to three things that often play into that. One of those is just the values of the local community. If the local community is largely homogeneous, people have basically the same worldviews, basically the same value system, basically the same belief systems, then there may be a lot of things that are permissible in that setting that wouldn't be in other settings. I always use the example that in Humansville, Missouri, up until late in the 20th century, it was fine for the 10 Commandments to hang on the walls of the public school there. But as the town of Humansville became more heterogeneous, there were other belief systems that began to be represented in that town. It became more pluralistic religiously, meaning that there's more than one religious worldview. There were people that didn't want the 10 Commandments on the public school wall. And suddenly that school found itself in a court battle over whether the 10 Commandments could hang in their public school or not. So part of it is about the local values of the community as far as what would determine what's okay and what's not okay. And that's why a lot of towns can get by with doing a lot of things as far as having religion in their public school system, because most of the people in the town hold that same value system. But as that value system begins to become more pluralistic, more heterogeneous, then often a lot of those policies begin to have to change. A second determinant of that, which is probably the most significant, if a community began to become more heterogeneous, and so a case had to be decided about what was okay and what's not okay, then the basis would become the Constitution of the United States, and particularly the First Amendment to the Constitution. And as you may know, the First Amendment contains what's called the Bill of Rights. 5 basic rights that all humans are entitled to. freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to petition the government, and freedom of religion and religious expression. So when you go to the Constitution and what the Constitution says about religion and religious freedom, religious expression, religious restriction, again, I ask students, so what all does the Constitution say? And I hear things like separation of church and state, that you can't impose your beliefs on others, you can't offend people with your religious beliefs, you can't be restricted from practicing your religious beliefs. But at the core, the Constitution only has one statement about that. And this is that statement. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's all it says. That's it. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, that's typically broken up, that statement is typically broken up into two clauses. The first clause is typically called the Establishment Clause, and then the second part of that is typically called the Free Exercise Clause. So let's talk about the Establishment Clause a little bit first, which tends to be the one that most often is debated in courts and in communities. The Establishment Clause is the part of that Statement of Religious Freedom from the Constitution that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now certainly when the framers of the Constitution wrote that clause back a couple hundred years ago, their concern was reflective of situations that they had dealt with in Europe before they had come here, where by and large they came from countries or from cities where the religion and the government were tightly interlinked. They scratched one another's back. They kind of upheld one another in a strong power system, a strong system of control. And they wanted to get away from that because in those countries, to be truly a good citizen of that country, you also had to be a certain, or at least claim a certain religious belief. And if your religious belief was different, then it was difficult to live within the government, within the system of that country. And so they wanted to set up a system where we could have a government, we could have a country that people could freely exercise their rights, and where people would not have to choose adherence to a particular belief system or choose to reject a particular belief system. And so that's largely, at least why the framers of the Constitution wrote this, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And the gist of that being that the government could not set up an official church that was the church of the government or the church of the ruler of that state, of that region, or of this country. But it also has come to mean several other things as far as how that plays out with the development of our country. It may also sometimes be interpreted that the government nor religion can pass laws that aid one religion or aid all religions or prefer one religion over another. So it can't give preference to religion over secularism, that the government cannot give preference to one religion over another religion. Another way it's sometimes interpreted is that the government cannot influence a person to remain away from church against their will or to force them to profess a belief in any religion. That again, people are free to choose their religious belief or free to reject religion or free to not even have religion be on the radar screen. And the government cannot speak to that. It's the personal choice. That the government cannot participate in the affairs of any religious organization. That religious organizations are free to make their decisions, set up their government, run as they choose to. That someone cannot be punished for entertaining or professing a particular religious belief system. And also that another thing that's played out over time is that no tax in any amount can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions. And that one's one where there's some debate about because we have this issue right now of faith-based initiatives in our government, where the question is, if we have local service organizations that are secular, that serve the needs of the poor, but they're not able to adequately do that, and so they also rely on religious organizations to help meet the needs of the poor, then should the government provide funding for those religious organizations to do that? Well, from the traditional interpretation of the Establishment Clause, the answer is no. But under current administration and current government, that's being reconsidered. That maybe there would be times that tax money could be given to religious organizations if they were enabling or enhancing what government agencies were trying to do but couldn't do on their own. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then, so I asked students with our list on the board, so which of these policies are efforts to be consistent with this Establishment Clause? And generally they say things from the board that to not allow school employees or administration or faculty to lead out in religious practice or religious exercises. Because in so doing, it would be, in a sense, establishing that religion. Having an agent of the government, an arm of the government, public schools, enforce religion. And so when there's a policy that, yeah, students can get together and pray, but coaches, teachers, school administrators cannot lead that or cannot organize that, that's an attempt to be consistent with the Establishment Clause. Or when a school says, yeah, we have a baccalaureate service, it's a religious service for our graduates, but it's not required for students to attend it. It's held off campus, and it's run by students and by local clergy, not by the school itself. Well, that's an effort to be consistent with the Establishment Clause, to not give preference to religion or religious service over people who would choose not to participate in religious service. The second part of that statement of religious freedom is what we sometimes call the Free Exercise Clause. And that's the part that says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. That people should be free to practice religion as they want, when they want, how they want, without government interference. That neither the state nor the federal government can oppose or prohibit one's religious practice. And so again, when I ask students, so which of these policies or practices that we've listed on the board, which of those are consistent with the Free Exercise Clause? They would say things like that students can gather around the flagpole and pray, and students can lead that themselves. That students can have a Bible study before school. They can gather for that, as long as they're the ones that organize it. That there can be a student organization that's religiously oriented, but it's entirely run by students. That those are efforts to be consistent with the Free Exercise Clause. Now, I mentioned a phrase earlier that is a phrase that's typically linked with this statement of religious freedom from the First Amendment to the Constitution. And often it's thought to be a phrase that's in the Constitution, but it's not. And that's the phrase separation of church and state. Now, certainly it's a phrase that, again, has become tightly linked, especially with that Establishment Clause. But where does it come from? What's the source of that? When the First Amendment was adopted, immediately there were questions about what that meant. There still are today. There are hundreds of cases over the course of history, thousands of cases related to interpretation of the First Amendment, especially that statement of religious freedom. But even from nearly day one, there were questions about, so what does this mean that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and at the same time that Congress should not prohibit the free exercise of religion? And so there was a religious organization, the Danbury Baptist Association, that sent a letter asking about that. So what's this mean? What are we saying? And Thomas Jefferson was selected as the one to respond to this inquiry that they made. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote back, he wrote a letter trying to explain what was meant by the First Amendment. And in that letter, he used this phrase, separation of church and state. Now, I always ask students, so what does that mean? And generally, people say something like that church and government should have, or that religion and government should have nothing to do with each other. That there should be a high, wide, hard wall between religion and between government in our country. That's what separation of church and state is. Well, Jefferson defined that phrase in his letter. And he said this, that the idea of the First Amendment was to erect a wall of separation between religion and government. And he went on to say that the purpose of that wall is to, quote, ensure no unnecessary entanglement between the two, between religion and government. Okay, so Jefferson said there's this wall between religion and government that is there to ensure no unnecessary entanglement. So I asked students, what's kind of curious about the definition for that wall that Jefferson gave? And students always say, no unnecessary entanglement. And so we get talking about what that means, and it would sound like, which I think is the case, that Jefferson was saying there might be times that there would be necessary entanglement between the two. But the purpose of this First Amendment statement of religious freedom is to ensure that that doesn't happen unnecessarily, that the government doesn't unnecessarily come in and start telling religious groups how to run their religious organization. And at the same time, that religion doesn't begin to have one religion particularly doesn't begin to have too much power in or over government. That would be unnecessary or undesired even entanglement. But maybe there would be times that would be good for those to be entangled. Again, the example we use in class is the idea of those faith-based initiatives. I'm not saying whether I support that or not. I can land on either side of the fence with that. But if we have a problem of poverty in our cities, and if government agencies are not able to adequately meet that need, and so they are relying on religious organizations to help meet that need, then maybe that's a case for necessary entanglement, for the government to enable these religious organizations to better serve alongside them. I don't know, but that may be a case for that. And so that's where the idea of separation of church and state came about, and probably the high, wide, hard wall that we think of today is probably not the high, wide, hard wall that Jefferson thought of when he seemed to indicate there might be times that the two could intermix and could entangle with one another. There's a few other corollaries to this idea of the First Amendment. One of those is the idea of strict neutrality. Often when you look at court cases related to the First Amendment and issues of religious freedom or religious expression, you will see the opinion of the justice or one of the judges use the phrase strict neutrality. That the government should not aid religion or support religion, and at the same time, the government should not oppose or prohibit religion, but be strictly neutral. I always think about it like a tug of war rope, and that it sounds like the ideal from that statement of religious freedom from the First Amendment is that the government would keep the bandana around the rope right in the middle, strictly neutral, neither aiding nor opposing religion. Now, of course, the question is that possible? Or is there kind of a range around that middle section on either side of the bandana that we might still call strict neutrality, but it's really not strictly neutral? Because again, is that possible? One of the examples that I used that some students gave me a few years ago, or a student gave me a few years ago, was that I think it shows almost how difficult and maybe seemingly audacious it could be to try to find that strictly neutral point. And they were talking about it at their school, that before every football game, there was always a prayer that was prayed, I guess for the game, for the teams. And apparently some issue had been raised. And so the way the school tried to find this strictly neutral position is that they decided that, first of all, if students wanted to pray before the game, they could. They were not going to oppose that religious expression. And yet, they went on to say, but if you want to pray over a sound system, you've got to bring your own. You can't use ours. Because that would be the school supporting religion and doing that. That might have been one of the most purely, strictly neutral positions. They weren't going to oppose it, pray if you want, but they weren't going to aid it. Use your own sound system. But I think that's probably the difficulty of strict neutrality, and that's probably why we have thousands of cases related to these issues of religious expression, religious restriction, because there's probably an area around that bandana in the middle of the rope that we're trying to negotiate all the time for strict neutrality. One other kind of corollary to the First Amendment is what's sometimes called equal access. And it's the idea that if one religion is given an area of expression or an area of freedom, then if there are other religions or other religious people that want to inhabit that same area, that they have equal access to that. And so if the Muslim kids want to have a study of the Quran before school, and that's allowed, then if some Christian kids come along and want to have a Bible study before school, they also need to be allowed that. If there's a pagan group of students that comes along and they want to have some sort of a spiritual exercise before school, they should be allowed that they have equal access. Preference should not be given to one religious group over another. And so that tends to be another corollary of that. So, as far as what's legal, what's constitutional, local community values are taken into consideration. Interpretation of the Statement of Religious Freedom from the First Amendment, Establishment Free Exercise Clause, is taken into consideration. And a third consideration is court precedent, previous court cases, and what were decided in those court cases. And again, as I've mentioned, there are many of those cases. As a matter of fact, I think there'll be a link here in a little bit, but there's a site online called firstamendmentcenter.org. And it's a great resource for looking up all the cases that have been documented related to the Statement of Religious Freedom, because you can, under firstamendmentcenter.org, you can go to religious liberty. And you can find cases there. You can find what the decisions were. You can find ways that the Establishment Free Exercise Clauses have been interpreted by the courts, statements judges have made about those clauses. But also, for those of you who may educate, there's a kind of an educator section where you can pull up abstracts of court cases and have classes talk about what would be the constitutional response to this court case and explanations for that, which sometimes I use in my classes. So that's a great resource to look at a lot of these cases. But probably one of the cases that it would be considered a landmark case as far as the presence of religion in a public educational setting would be a case from 1963. And it's a court case called the Abington versus Shem court case. In this situation, Abington was the school district. It was in Abington Township in the state of Pennsylvania. And there was a family, the Shem family, that had their kids enrolled in this public school there in Abington Township in Pennsylvania. And what was going on at this time, actually all this I think started in the late 1950s before it finally reached the court in 1963, was that according actually to Pennsylvania law, in every public school classroom at the beginning of the day, and I'll quote this, at least 10 verses from the Holy Bible shall be read without comment at the opening of each public school day. Any child shall be excused from such Bible reading upon written request of his parent or guardian. Also, typically along with that, which was the case in this school, is there would also be a recitation of the Lord's Prayer. That again, students were free not to recite that if they didn't want to. Well, the Shem family, who were actually a religious family, but they came to the school and they said, you know, this isn't reflective of our religious belief. And so we don't want our children to have to participate in this every day. Of course, the school said, well, they don't have to. According to state law, they can be excused from that Bible reading upon written request from you. They don't have to recite the prayer when we recite the prayer. But what's that like for a child? To be in a room with 25 or 30 other peers, and they are all participating in something, and they choose not to. They stay seated. They obviously don't speak while everybody else is speaking and reciting this prayer. Well, that puts a pressure on kids, is what the Shem family was saying. That even though it sounds like they're given freedom not to participate, there's still a social pressure to participate because of this. And so they asked the school to quit doing this exercise, which obviously they did not, thus ending up in the court system. So finally, this went to the Supreme Court. And when it all came down, what the court decided was that the family won the case and the school lost. So the school, and obviously this was even a statement about a Pennsylvania law at that time, the school could no longer require reading from the Holy Bible at the beginning of every school day or require the Lord's Prayer to be recited by students in every classroom. Well, the initial response to that on really a national scale was kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Again, in my classes, I ask students, so if you were aware of this court case in 1963, and what you heard was that the school lost, what would you assume? And again, they usually say things like, well, the Bible can't be in schools. Religion can't be in schools. Can't talk about religion in school. And that was largely the assumption that was made. And so it was at that point that you found a lot of religion and religious influence being taken out of the schools, whether it was these devotional Bible readings or these prayers at the beginning of the day, or even whether it was allusions to religious influence in history books or social studies books. That suddenly religion began being yanked out of public school curriculum everywhere because no school, no textbook company wanted to be the next people in the Supreme Court, in front of the media, having such a situation go on. Well, let me read to you, because again, that was a reaction based basically on news headlines that pretty much permeated throughout our country. But with every decision, especially that the Supreme Court makes, it's not that they say you win, you lose, and everybody goes home, but they write opinions about that, or they write what they believe, what the judges write, what they would call implications, basically, of their decision. What they intended by their decision and what they did not intend by their decision. And for this court case, that's a several-page opinion written by Justice Clark. But let me just read a portion of that I think might have had some effect on the knee-jerk reaction if this had been more obvious to people. One of the judges who made this decision said this: "It's insisted that unless these religious exercises are permitted, a religion of secularism is established in the schools." Okay, so he's saying, all right, we know that one of the issues here is that people think that if we tell the school that they have to stop doing this, that we are giving secularism, or the worldview of secularism, preference over the worldview of religion. But he goes on to say, "We agree that the state may not establish a religion of secularism in the sense of affirmatively opposing or of showing hostility to religion." Free exercise clause. "Thus preferring those who believe in no religion over those who do believe." And he refers back to another landmark case, Zorach versus Clausen. So he's saying, okay, we know that you could say that, okay, so you've got the Shemps, which might be reflective of a worldview or religion of secularism. You've got the stance of the school and many constituents of the school who have a Christian religion or a Christian worldview. And some are saying that if we tell the school they have to stop, we're giving the worldview of secularism preference over the worldview of religion. And Judge Clark is saying that's not what's happening in this decision. We're not saying secularism is better than a religious worldview. We do not agree, however, that this decision in any sense has that effect. In addition, and this is especially for those of us in the field of religious studies, this is a part of that that's really key. In addition, it might be well said that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. And it certainly may be said that the Bible is worthy of study for its literary and historic qualities. So were the justices saying, take religion and all religion out of schools? No. As a matter of fact, they were saying that your education isn't complete unless you've had an opportunity to study religion from an objective perspective, from an historical perspective, from a literary perspective. That's a key part of understanding our civilization, is to understand the role of religion. He goes on to say, nothing we have said here in this decision where the school lost and the family won, nothing we have said here indicates that such a study of the Bible or religion, an objective study, when presented objectively as part of a secular program of education, may not be affected consistently with the First Amendment. So he's going on and saying, if there's an objective study of religion within a public school setting, we're not condemning that. As a matter of fact, we're saying that's a necessary part of one's education. However, these exercises, the reading from the Holy Bible and the reciting of the Lord's Prayer, do not fall under those categories. They are religious exercises being required by the states in violation of the First Amendment that the government maintain strict neutrality, neither aiding nor opposing religion. So they drew a line between two words that you'll see here on the slide. They drew a line between indoctrination versus investigation. That to indoctrinate regarding religion in a public school setting, to try to persuade to a particular worldview, to give preference to a particular worldview, to try to convert to a particular worldview, to try to assert a particular worldview on students, indoctrination, that's not constitutionally protected, or that wouldn't be protected by the courts. But to investigate religion, to investigate religion's role in society and in civilization, to investigate various world religions and their belief systems and their history, to investigate religious scriptures. Not so much for their doctrinal content, but just for the literary and historic, potentially historic content. That those are necessary and certainly protected aspects of one's education. That indoctrination of religion in a public school setting would not be protected, but investigation of religion in a public school setting, an objective study of religion, would be constitutionally protected. And so, that's why you can be a student here at Missouri State University, and you can look at the core requirements for your general education, and you will find religion classes there. Classes that look at the history of religions. Classes that look objectively at the text of certain religions. Classes that give an overview of religion, like this class does, about why people are religious, the philosophy of religion, basic beliefs of various religions. Those are investigative studies of religion that are permitted and protected by the courts. And that's what we're going to do in this class. Well, we're going to wrap up there for right now, but then we're going to go to Roman numeral 2 of this discussion and talk about not only that it's okay, that it's constitutional for religion to be part of your educational program here, but that it might even be relevant to your life and to preparation for your career to take some time to study religion as part of your educational process.